I was initially a little bit resistant, and I had the, oh, I'm a poor grad student identity. I definitely did. I thought of myself as a poor graduate student and thought, well, all grad students are poor. That's what it's supposed to be. And I hadn't challenged that at all at that point.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhD's podcast, a higher education in personal finance. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Roberts. This is Season 5, Episode 15, and today my guest is Dr. Amanda, a tenure-track professor at a small college in the Midwest. When she started graduate school, Amanda was disengaged from her finances. She had resigned herself to being a poor graduate student until she encountered Ramit Sethi's book, I Will Teach You to Be Rich. Slowly, the financial messages in that book replaced the limiting beliefs she had absorbed from academia. Amanda took small steps to improve her finances, starting with her bank accounts, and over time, her strides with her finances became bigger and bigger. At the end of the episode, we get a glimpse at how the hard and slow work she did on her finances during grad school and her postdoc is now paying off in spades. Without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Amanda.
I'm so glad to have Dr. Amanda joining me on the podcast again today. She was first on in Season 1, Episode 11, talking about geographic arbitrage and her career transition from her postdoc into her academic job. And anyway, if you didn't listen to that episode and you have time right now, go back and listen to it. But today we're going to pick up and talk about something that she briefly mentioned in that first interview that I thought was fascinating enough. I wanted a whole interview devoted to it, which is her financial turnaround story. So we would definitely say that Dr. Amanda is financially successful today, but she did not always identify that way. So we're going to explore that story in a lot more depth. So Amanda, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast and being willing to share this aspect of your story.
Thanks for having me.
So would you please tell us a little bit more about yourself, maybe for those of you who didn't listen to the first episode?
Sure. So I am an assistant professor in a college of education. And I work primarily with doctoral level students. So I teach courses on research, writing, qualitative methods, and then I also teach a course on information literacy and innovation. And so, yeah, and my background is in digital media and learning, and specifically video games and learning. So a lot of my research has been around the digital games industry and then how people learn from playing video games, both games designed to be educational, but also commercial games and game communities.
Great. And tell us briefly about where you went to graduate school, where you did your postdoc, and about your family, how that formed along the way.
Sure. So I guess the first thing is after I graduated from college, I moved out to the San Francisco Bay Area for a short time and worked as an editor in the games industry. And that's how I developed an interest in video games and doing work on games. But I was always a school person, and I had intended to go back to school to attend graduate school. And so I decided at that time that I wanted to do something with games. So when I was looking for graduate programs, my criteria was I want to work with people who are doing interesting things with video games. And I felt like there was a lot of emphasis on games research, on games and obesity, games and violence, really negative things. And I thought, there are a lot of great things happening in this industry. And I felt like there was a lot of potential for games to be used for more positive impact. And so my search for graduate programs was really just who's doing stuff around, games and their potential. And so I found a group of people at the University of Wisconsin-Madison called the Games Learning Society Group. And they were a group of scholars doing really fascinating work from a games and learning perspective. And so these were people looking at games like Civilization and World of Warcraft, and how are people, how are students learning about history from a systemic point of view from Civilization, and how are high school boys who are really disengaged with school, acquiring literacy skills and critical thinking skills and math skills from playing World of Warcraft. And so that was graduate school. And then following that, I did a postdoc at USC, the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where I worked on a project where we were looking at using a game to teach first-generation low-income students about the process of applying for college.
Wow, that is so fascinating. And I think along the way, you met your husband, is that right?
I did. So I met my husband, Dennis, in graduate school. His advisor was actually married to my advisor.
Oh, wow.
So kind of
Incestuous
hilarious.
relationship.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I was, I think, resistant to dating him for a little while because of that, but he just turned out to be too awesome of a person. And so we started dating in grad school, and then we ended up getting married during the postdoc, and he went out to Los Angeles with me.
So, and was he doing a postdoc during that time as well, or did he have a different type of
He
job?
was working for the university. I'm blanking on his job title now, but he was working with the USC Games Group, teaching courses and then also doing helping manage their tech program. So he was working more with students who are learning to be game developers, and then I was in the College of Education doing work. It was a large grant with the U.S. Department of Education is what I was working on.
Okay, yeah. And going back to that first interview, the transition out of your postdoc, deciding where to apply for academic jobs, all of that we covered in the previous interview. So if people are interested in your subsequent career path, they can go back and listen to that. But today we're going to be talking about your financial journey during that whole time. So can you start with kind of the before, when you weren't feeling so financially successful? What was your financial life like at that time, and what were your financial attitudes?
Yeah, so I think it wasn't even that I wasn't feeling financially successful. I wasn't financially engaged. And so, I think I had this narrative in my head, you know what, I'm good at school. As long as I do well in school and I work hard, I will be successful. And that is something that I worry about when I'm done with school later on when I'm an adult, even though, of course, if you get a PhD, you end up spending a good amount of time in school as an adult. But I had this attitude that money was something that I would worry about later.
I'm curious how that actually plays in because you had work experience prior to starting your PhD. So is that the same attitude that you had at that time, or did it actually switch when you entered graduate school?
Yeah, so I was working, I did work full time, as an editor after my undergrad. And so I started paying off my student loans. And I didn't have a huge number of student loans, but I had taken out some loans. Particularly, I took 2 classes abroad when I was an undergrad. And so I had borrowed some money beyond scholarships for that. And so, I started making the payments and I just, sent in, whatever the minimum expected payment amount was and wasn't really thinking about it. I mean, I did pretty well in that I was an English major who at least managed to pay my rent and make a living in San Francisco. And this was right around the time of the beginning of the financial crisis, too. So there was a lot of anxiety, and I knew a lot of people who were laid off at that time. So I kind of felt like, oh, well, I'm paying, I have a job and I'm paying the rent and it's San Francisco. So I must be doing just fine or even really great. And so, things like investing for the long term or bigger goals weren't really on my radar. I was just sort of, paying the rent and paying the student loans.
Yeah, well, given the time and the place that you were in, I actually think you probably were doing very well. But in graduate school, you had that same attitude of just kind of going along and school is your primary focus. Is that right?
Yeah, so I hadn't really had a good understanding of how graduate school was different from undergraduate. And so I borrowed money my first year of grad school. I sort of took out whatever loans were offered as a part of the FAFSA, even though I had a project assistantship that year. And it wasn't until I was kind of well into that first year that I understood, oh, you can work as a project assistant, a research assistant, a teaching assistant, and throughout grad school, I had each of those roles, and that can be enough to live on. I mean, it's not an exciting lifestyle, but I hadn't realized at first that I didn't need to be taking out those loans. And so I took them out, and then, I just didn't do anything mindful with them. I probably did a little bit of travel. I ate out probably more than I needed to. And just that money sort of trickled through, I didn't blow through it right away or anything like that, or need to take out additional loans, but I just didn't understand, the ways that you could avoid taking on additional debt in grad school. I sort of treated it like undergrad, just not knowing how that system worked until I was further along.
I see. Yeah, that kind of makes sense actually, because yeah, you were thinking about yourself as a student again. And yeah, I guess that's part of what this podcast is about, right? Like making a wider awareness known that graduate school should be handled financially completely differently than you handled your undergraduate degree.
Yes.
So when did this start to change? When did you start to have a greater degree of engagement or awareness around your finances?
Sure. So my boyfriend at the time, now husband, had started reading I Will Teach You to Be Rich, a book by Ramit Sethi. And if you're not familiar with it, it's really a book that just sort of walks you through how to set up a financial framework to help you be successful. And so he talks about how to use credit cards strategically, how to set up the right sorts of bank accounts, checking, savings, how to get started investing. And so he was reading that book. And so we just decided to read it together. And so we worked through it chapter by chapter. And, from there, we started feeling really motivated by that book in particular.
This is really interesting to me because this may be a better question like for your husband, but the title of Ramit's book, I Will Teach You to Be Rich, how did you even have the idea that book was for you, right? Was it because rich was nowhere near what was going on for you, like at that
Not
time,
even close.
right?
Yeah,
but maybe it was the teach you, like you were a learner, you wanted to be taught.
I remember being really resistant to the book because I hated the title. I remember actually like making fun of it or just, saying, wow, it seems really cocky. And there were parts of the writing style where I felt like it was a little more aggressive than really appealed to me. But I also found I was just kind of drawn in by some of the message. So I was initially a little bit resistant, and I had I'm a poor grad student identity. I definitely did. I thought of myself as a poor graduate student and thought, well, all grad students are poor. That's what it's supposed to be. And I hadn't challenged that at all at that point. But I do remember being actually turned off by the title of the book. So it's funny that you mentioned that. But he was reading it, and I think it was fun to be reading a book together too, and sort of having that partner to talk things through and bounce ideas off of. And then we were able to hold each other accountable to actually doing something once we had read through the book.
Yeah. So did you encounter any other resistance to that identity as a poor graduate student? Was that pushing back at all against the messaging that you were receiving from the book?
Yeah, so, I came up against some limiting beliefs at that point. As I was reading the book, I started having these feelings that, oh, well, I feel like I'm starting too late. Or as a graduate student, I don't make enough money for financial planning to be worthwhile. That's still not something I can do. So I was simultaneously feeling like I had waited too long and like I still needed to wait longer. And that was really frustrating for me because I have the type of personality where once I decide I want to do something, I want to act on it right now or yesterday. And so it was frustrating to me to start learning about all these things, but not really feel like I had the means to put everything that I wanted to into place right away.
Yeah, I can imagine that a lot of people starting to learn about personal finance in graduate school from whatever source can feel that way. And it's to your credit that you kept engaging with the material, I guess, instead of just totally turning it off or say, oh, I'll have to pick up this book again, in a few years later on. I could definitely understand why hearing the message, while maybe not, this is not what he intended, but to you interpreting as I'm already starting too late when you were probably in your mid 20s or so, like
Yeah,
it's
mid to
not
late 20s.
yeah, it's not like objectively actually that late, but when you understand that people who did not go the graduate school route can, be working on this right away, when they finish their bachelor's or even potentially earlier, that can be really frustrating. And like you said, you have all these great ideas once you start accepting the messages, but still nothing has really changed in terms of your means and ability to work on them. But still, you were able to start making some changes. So what were once you started accepting the messages, what did you do right away, even while you were still in graduate school?
Sure. So, the book actually had really specific instructions about how to set up. I don't think he frames it this way, but it's essentially setting up a framework for yourself. And so, one of the things that SETI talks about is getting away from high fee brick and mortar banks. So, a lot of banks charge to have a checking account if you don't have a certain amount of money in it. And for most graduate students, those minimums aren't necessarily realistic. ATM fees and are things that just can kind of bleed through. So he had recommended switching to an online bank, and at the time he had specifically, I think, recommended the Charles Schwab high yield investor checking. And so we both switched over our banks because both of us, I think one of us was with Wells Fargo at the time, the other was with Bank of America. And so we were with exactly those banks that he was saying, you know what, these are just set up to make you fail. Like they're never going to do you any favors. Get out.
I
And
don't
so
think anything has changed in the 10 or so years since that point. I would still say anyone who's with Bank of America and Wells Fargo, get out of that relationship ASAP.
exactly. And one of the things that I love about the Charles Schwab account and that I think is really good for grad students, especially if you're presenting research, is you get reimbursed ATM fees from anywhere in the world. And so any ATM fees that you end up paying while you're at a conference, it can even be an international conference where those can be really steep fees. At the end of the month, you will get a deposit into your checking account that reimburses you for all of those fees. And so that's a feature that I just really like. And it's not a lot of money, but over, several years, that does start to add up.
And I think that on, graduate student stipend, those $3 or $5 here and there, I don't know, it's a higher percentage of the money that you're working with as a graduate student than it would be maybe Ramit's general audience, right? Like maybe that tip is, okay, it's a good thing for them to do, but it doesn't make that big of an impact. But for a graduate student coming up at the end of the month with $20 extra or so, like that can make a decent, difference in your life. Especially if your savings goal starts out at that $10, $20, $50 level. That can really help you meet that.
Yeah. And, it's okay if that's where you're starting. Another thing that we did is we set up higher interest savings accounts. And this was when interest rates were really low. Like right now, it's realistic to maybe get, at the time of this recording anyway, 2% or a little over 2% on a savings account. At that time, I believe like 1% was the absolute most you were going to get. And so we weren't talking a lot of money, but, it was the same principle. It was, I have a really terrible account. It was with one of those banks where I think, the interest was under 0.05%, right? So even with a lot of money, you're not going to be earning anything. And so, with the amount of money that we had in savings at that time, 1% was still only earning us maybe pennies, a few more pennies, but a few more pennies. But over time, as we started saving more and built up an emergency fund, those pennies became a latte every month. And then now, it looks a little bit more like a dinner out, maybe a modest dinner out, but it's something. And, I think it's important to, if you can aggregate those kinds of small gains across a bunch of areas, then they do start to make a difference, and it's changing your attitude from, I don't care that I'm bleeding money a little bit here and there on fees and interest that I could be earning. It's saying I'm taking control of this and I am mindful of where all of those dollars go and how I can, be in control of my financial situation.
Yeah, I can see how this example of changing where you bank can be a really impactful, like psychological win at the start of a financial journey, like what you're talking about, because it's not like you've set a savings goal and that you're feeling discouraged about that because, you only make X amount of money. It's something that you do have complete control over. And it doesn't cost you any money. In fact, it's going to be, bringing money back into your account, a few dollars at a time. So I can definitely see how this can be a wonderful first step to take when you're starting to take control of your financial life. You actually just mentioned a term. I wonder, based on our last interview, if you also listened to the Choose FI podcast.
Definitely.
Okay, so they have this term. Yeah, you didn't quite say it the way they did.
Okay,
aggregation of marginal gains. Yeah, aggregation of marginal gains.
Yep.
So I'll explain that for the audience. This Choose FI podcast is about the financial independence movement. We've had a pair of interviews on that with Gov Worker in season 3. So if you want to learn more about the FIRE movement, financial independence and retire early, you can listen to that one. We also touched on it in Amanda's first interview. But anyway, on this Choose FI podcast, they have this term that they've come up with throughout their episodes, the aggregation of marginal gains, which is when you just make a tiny little change in your financial life, like the one that Amanda just mentioned of stopping to pay ATM fees or stopping to pay fees just to hold a small balance in a checking or savings account. Those are very, very small things to do. But once you add up 10 small things or 100 small things, that aggregation becomes really, really significant in your finances. So this can be that step 1 for your aggregation of marginal gains. So yeah, thank you so much for that example, Amanda.
Emily here for a brief interlude. Tax season is upon us. And while no one loves this time of year, it's particularly difficult for postbac fellows, funded grad students, and postdoc fellows. Even professional tax preparers are often thrown for a loop by our unique tax situation. And don't get me started on tax software. I provide tons of support at this time of year for PhD trainees preparing their tax returns. From free articles and videos, to paid at-your-own-pace workshops, to live seminars and webinars for universities and research institutes. The best place to go to check out all of this material is pfforphds.com/tax. That's pfforphds.com/TAX. Don't struggle through tax season on your own. Visit my website for the exact information you need in the most efficient form available. Now back to the interview.
Anything else like structurally that you changed around your finances at that time when you first started following the I Will Teach You to Be Rich framework?
One other account that I got set up, which I think in the long run is going to have been really important, is taking control of getting started with retirement savings. And so because I had opened the checking account with Charles Schwab, which is an investment firm, I also then opened a Roth IRA. And I forced myself to remember that I had had some 401k savings from that editorial job that I had had before, but I wasn't paying any attention to it. I couldn't have told you how much I had saved. I sort of knew where it was. I didn't know. I still to this day do not know how I had had that money invested at that time. So what I did is I opened up an IRA and I rolled that 401k over. And it was not much money because I had not been, at the time I had been in San Francisco, I was proud to be paying my rent. I wasn't worried about saving for, decades out in the future. But what I did is I got that money to where now I knew where it was. And then I had it on my radar to when I had, windfall money from contract work or, side projects that I was doing. I was like, you know what, I can start to invest in a Roth IRA. And that's something that, sure, it would have been great to start at 18, but I can start right now. And that's still going to be really good for me over time.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that you specifically tied like any windfall money or any, extra side hustle money or whatever it was, you then had a place to put it, right? There wasn't the extra hurdle of, oh, I have an extra $50 in my account right now. What do I do with it? I'm not sure. And it ends up just floating away somewhere. You don't even know where it went. You had then a place to put it. And so this is another great first step to take, is just to open an account, just to set it up. As long as there's no minimum or you can meet the minimum required to open it, just so you have a place for that money to go. I think it makes such a huge difference that you're not, once you have that goal in mind, okay, any money, extra money that comes in, this is where it goes.
Yep.
And you can actually, it's really easy to follow through on that once you've gotten over sort of the activation barrier of setting up the account.
And both my husband and I, throughout the years, have split that money between Roth IRAs, and then that's how we made substantial payments to our student loans. And so, both of us have done side projects where we might get a couple $1,000s here and there, for consulting work or book projects or other things. And so we were very mindful that 100% of that money, we would just take it and allocate it toward one of those two goals. And so we had actually paid off a good chunk of student loans while we were still in school or within that first year, just because we were really consistent about taking that extra money and putting all of it towards either long-term investments or towards the student loans with the highest interest rates. Because at that point, we had then, pooled together all of those loans and actually started tracking, okay, what are the interest rates on each of these and which do we need to tackle first?
Yeah. So is that something else you learned from I Will Teach You to Be Rich? Like how to handle the debt? Were you following that part of Ramit's plan as well?
Yes, yeah. And we were big fans. For us, it was obvious for us that we wanted to tackle highest interest rate first. I know, some people will start with the smallest loans just to get those wins, that sort of dopamine hit from, getting a loan paid off. But for us, we really did, even if the higher interest rate loans were bigger, we started with those.
So you were going through the remainder of your graduate degree and you had this system for, living off of your stipend for your budget and then pushing forward your finances with the extra money that was coming in. That's how you finished out graduate school. Was there anything you did to keep yourself kind of on this path of, sticking to your goals and sticking to this idea of financial improvement through that time?
Yeah. So, I mentioned that I have I want to do things now sort of personality. So as we transitioned from graduate school to the postdoc phase where we were in a higher cost of living area, but we were making more money. And so I felt like, okay, now we can start to do some more things. There are things that we couldn't do as students that now we can really tackle. And so one of the things we did, we were in Los Angeles, which means we spent a good amount of time in traffic. So we were fortunate enough, we both were working at USC at the same university. So that meant we had a good chunk of time every day in the car. And so we started listening to podcasts at that time. And so we really, there's a handful of podcasts that we had started listening to. Let's see. We started listening to Afford Anything, Paula Pant's podcast. We listened to The Mad Fientist, which is another financial independence podcast. We started listening to some entrepreneurial and side hustle podcasts. So we were really just kind of looking for ideas for, things we could do. And those podcasts really kind of helped keep us looking for new improvements that we could make and just kept us motivated too. Sometimes your financial goal, the smart thing is not to change your goals, but just keep doing what you're doing. But for me, I needed that motivation. I needed to be constantly learning new things and, assimilating new information and then making little tweaks along the way.
Yeah, I think those are all fantastic suggestions. I also love listening to podcasts. Not surprisingly, having my own podcast, I love the medium and listen to a lot of different ones. All the ones that you mentioned are excellent. We've already mentioned Choose FI. That could be another one to throw into the mix for the listener. Of course, mine has a completely different audience than many of these other ones. So, if you're already a listener, please stick with it because I think this will help motivate you as well. And then the other one that I really like for motivation is Dave Ramsey's podcast/radio show. You probably have to be in a debt repayment phase of life to really appreciate it. But he is very motivational. I will say that. That's another idea if you're looking for motivational podcasts. So let's take the last couple minutes here, Amanda, and just give us some highlights of what's been going on. What did you hit? You eventually paid off your student loan. So what have been the financial highlights of the years, finishing out your postdoc and then since then?
Yeah, so we were fortunate enough to really get our loans paid off within a couple of years of us graduating. And so that was a huge win for us. But of course, I wanted to keep that momentum going. Every time we complete a goal, I say, okay, but we can't lose momentum. So what are we going to do next? And so we paid off the student loans, and then we were kind of in that transition to a lower cost of living area, which I cover in that other podcast, so I won't talk about it. But that was another thing we wanted to do is my family's in the Midwest. I had wanted to get back to the Midwest. That was something that we felt was important before we started a family. So we started transitioning from high cost of living area to a lower cost of living area, and that made homeownership really feasible for us. So then we saved up, and at the end of the last year, we weren't planning to buy a house until this year, but we just ended up finding the right house in the right neighborhood, and we had enough saved where we were able to make that happen. And so that was kind of one of the latest things we did. And now we just had our first child. I had a daughter in June. And so we're wanting to get a little bit put away for her college already too. So we're working on that, and we're kind of hoping to make a purchase of a rental property in the next couple years. So that's another goal that we're working on right now.
Yeah, I think this is an amazing example of how much your financial progress accelerates once you have the higher income to be working with. And especially you can't expect that to necessarily happen if you haven't laid the groundwork earlier. If you do have the attitude of, well, I'm still in graduate school, I'm still in my postdoc, I just have to worry about money later, it's not necessarily all going to turn on a dime for you when your income changes. But for you, Amanda, because you guys had been working so diligently on these various goals with whatever means you had for all those years, once you had the higher incomes, it was just boom, you knew exactly what to do with it. You knew where to funnel your money. You could make really, really quick progress. And that's the same thing, that happened with my finances as well, laying the groundwork during graduate school. Once the income changed, the wins just come faster and faster and faster, even though they were really slow and hard fought in the beginning years. So yeah, I really appreciate hearing this more about that after, aspect of your story, after the financial transformation.
Yeah, I've heard that the first $100,000 is the hardest for net worth. And I do believe that that's probably true. I don't know how well documented that is, but that's something that I've heard before on podcasts and in other, and on blogs. And it does seem like it doesn't really matter if it's 100,000 or whatever it is. The beginning is the hardest to make progress because your money isn't making much money. You probably aren't making much money because otherwise you could be making things move a lot faster. But it is true that if you're just consistent about it and keep, have a framework set up and have goals that you're working towards, it does really feel like your ability to do things does, pick up the pace a little bit. So I
Yeah,
would agree with that.
I can definitely attest in my own life, the first 100,000, which I documented, actually it's in season 1, episode 1 of how we got to our first 100,000 of net worth. That was a long journey, and it's the next, iterations that have come a lot faster, obviously. Now, if you start, I didn't start very much in debt. We had sort of a slightly negative net worth, not huge. But if you have a very negative net worth, maybe you're working on over $100,000 of student loan debt to pay off. There's sort of 2 phases to that journey, right? There's getting to 0, and then there's getting to the first 100,000. And your first 100,000 of positive net worth will be easier than that, when you're working to get to 0. But so it'll be easier than that, but it will not be totally as easy as someone who started at 0, if that makes sense. So just because of the way the compound interest works.
And we did, when we first calculated our net worth, it was negative. It wasn't significantly negative. And I do agree that if you are one of those people who happens to have 6 figures of student loan debt, you've got, a different process to go through. Hopefully a soon to be future income that will help you tackle that with pretty good pace. But we did, when we first calculated it, it was below 0. And that was frustrating. That was definitely something for us that, it didn't feel good, but we knew that we couldn't get to 0 and above 0 without just, tackling it. And so we were fortunate enough, I think right around the time we got married, I think actually we calculated and we were at 0 when we got married. And we did not have an elaborate we had a very, very modest, tiny family-only wedding in order to keep it that way. We didn't want the wedding to drag us further down. But I think when we got married, we were right around 0. And so that was kind of a neat place because symbolically it was like, okay, we're married and now we have nowhere to go but up. Let's get moving on that.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. So final question here, Amanda, which is one that I ask all of my guests. Now, we've already heard you say a lot of financial advice during this entire podcast, but it was mostly you following the advice of others. So I'm curious, now that you've been through this whole process, what you would turn around and say to another early career PhD in terms of your best financial advice for that person.
Sure. So something that we do, and I guess this applies for people who have a partner. Something that my husband and I do is we do a monthly finance update. And it's really just a spreadsheet where we keep track of our debts and our savings and investments. And we just go through and update, the balances of all of those accounts every month. It doesn't really take long, but it's something that I look forward to because it means that we have a conversation around money. And it means that at least once a month, but probably more often just because it's become a hobby of mine. But, if it's not something you're that interested in, scheduling a regular check-in like once a month is just a good way to make sure that you're communicating financially. And I feel like that's been really good for us because it means we're making sure we're still on the same page about our goals. And if we are starting to have different ideas, then we have a conversation about, okay, do we want to prioritize this thing or this other thing first?
Yeah, that's a fantastic suggestion. Again, for anyone who is in a relationship with another person, however you handle your finances, joint, separate, or yours, mine, and ours, I think that monthly check-in can serve, any one of those models really well. So, Amanda, it's been an absolute delight to have you back on the podcast. I'm so glad that you made time for this. Congratulations on the new addition to your family.
Thank you,
both the baby and the house and the potential next rental property, all of it. It sounds wonderful. And it was really great to catch up with you today.
Yeah, you too. It was good to talk to you, Emily, and thanks for having me on.
Listeners, thank you for joining me for this episode. pfforphds.com/podcast is the hub for the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast. There, you can find links to all the episode show notes and a form to volunteer to be interviewed. I'd love for you to check it out and get more involved. If you've been enjoying the podcast, here are 4 ways you can help it grow. 1. Subscribe to the podcast and rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever platform you use. 2. Share an episode you found particularly valuable on social media or with your PhD peers. 3. Recommend me as a speaker to your university or association. My seminars cover the personal finance topics PhDs are most interested in, like investing, debt repayment, and taxes. 4. Subscribe to my mailing list at pfforphds.com/subscribe. Through that list, you'll keep up with all the new content and special opportunities for personal finance for PhDs. See you in the next episode, and remember, you don't have to have a PhD to succeed with personal finance, but it helps. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing and show notes creation by Lourdes Bobio.